There were two man-made famines in Soviet Ukraine, the first between 1921 and 1923, caused by Vladimir Lenin, the second in 1932 and 1933, caused by Joseph Stalin.
I don't think anyone who understands famine would view any famine as an atrocity. I can't think there are many examples in history of any famine being deliberately caused in order to starve people.
Holodomor can be literally translated to death by hunger.
Ukraine, mass man-made famine of 1921-1923. Was there a famine in Ukraine in 1922? By the beginning of May 1922, 3.7 million people were starving in 5 gubernias of Ukraine, about 35% of the total population of those gubernias. The number of people in need reached 6.6 million throughout Ukraine, 40% of them children. The territory of the mass man-made famine of 1921-1923 was not limited to 5 provinces, as it is usually written in Soviet historiography. At least 7 of the 9 provinces went on hunger strike. It was also a mass famine by other criteria. It covered both the village and the city, as well as all socio-professional groups: farmers, workers, intellectuals. Having seized power in Russia, Lenin and his associates hoped to receive Ukrainian bread for free to stay in power. In the conditions of then-hungry Russia, it was essential for them. However, the Ukrainian People's Republic government, as we know, refused to sell food without prepayment, and this angered Petrograd and provoked aggression against the young Ukrainian state.
Large-scale theft and expropriation was carried out under the guise of political necessity. Dissenters, the actual number of whom will never be known, would be labeled counter-revolutionary and systematically arrested or executed. As is usually the case in matters like this, those who had the least influence and occupied the weakest position, the Russian peasantry in this case, bore the brunt of the suffering. Lenin rejected Hoover's offer. His offer came with the condition that the ARA have full discretion over the Russian railway network and that they be allowed to hand out food impartially to all. Lenin rejected Hoover's offer, citing it as an interference in Russian internal affairs. His true reasoning for this decision was likely determined by self-serving political motives and the calculation that his forces would be able to manage the food shortages better than his opponents, and that the American personnel in the midst of his civil war may prove problematic. To make matters worse, 1920 yielded a meager crop, partly due to the disruption of agriculture production caused by the First World War and then by the Civil War, and partly by poor weather conditions in much of southeastern Russia. This one particularly bad year, as well as the steady depletion in both production and grain savings over the last several years, set the stage for what was to come. In the winter of 1920, Lenin, in contradiction to all reason and conscience, ordered increased emphasis on food requisitioning from the peasantry. In other words, he commanded the men under his control to take by force even more food and resources from already impoverished and hungry people. This included not just the produce of the most recent harvest, but also whatever remaining amounts of grain was left over from previous harvests. This self-styled policy of war communism amounted to little more than the mass confiscation of valuable resources which might be needed for the Red Army, including whatever grain was left in the countryside. This relentless pressure soon triggered the beginning of the famine in January 1921. Hunger was so severe that most people resorted to eating what little seed grain they had left. Without seed to plant, the famine worsened in the spring of 1921, and people were forced by hunger and desperation to sell all the meager possessions they had. The summer months brought no relief. Drought struck a hard blow to the Volga region in the summer of 1921, resulting in total crop failure. With death all around, cholera and spotted fever were rampant. As the famine worsened, tens of thousands of Russian peasants fled to the cities in hope of finding employment in the factories and better access to food. They found the situation no better. When foreign aid workers arrived in 1921, they found the streets of Moscow and Kiev littered with corpses and many people near death from starvation. The situation was even worse in rural villages. Those who had fled the countryside left entire families dead in their homes. Those who remained tried to live off whatever they could find, including things like seeds, acorns, grass, weeds, tree bark, and even the corpses of dead animals. Government officials in one town advised starving residents to dig up the dried bones of animals, grind them into a flour, and bake a, quote, bread substitute that has a nutritive value of 25% more than rye bread, in spite of its unpleasant smell and taste, end quote. The famine also gave rise to murder and cannibalism, as well as a black market trade in human flesh. Some Russian academics recorded examples of cannibalism and corpse eating. American relief workers also observed such behavior. Cannibalism was most common along the Volga River basin, where the famine was most severe. Starving peasants could be seen digging up recently buried corpses, so they could eat what little flesh remained. Accounts of murder or euthanasia, followed by butchery and feasting, were also reported. Parents and siblings ate the bodies of dead children. As the death toll mounted, illegal trade in human flesh emerged. Quantities of nondescript meat appeared in markets in Russian towns and cities, some of it undoubtedly human.
Holodomor can be literally translated to death by hunger. It's a horrifying fate that between 7 and 10 million people suffered in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933, thanks to the Soviet Union's harsh grain quotas and Joseph Stalin's underlying desire to totally subdue the Ukrainian population. In recent years, with further evaluation of Joseph Stalin's methods in Ukraine that led to this mass famine, historians have been forced to reconsider and reassess what happened between 1932 and 1933, with many now renaming the Holodomor as nothing shorter than genocide. Before joining the Soviet Union in 1922, Ukraine was its own independent, thriving nation. This was in no small part due to their flourishing agriculture, with lands full of fertile soil ripe for farming. The crops produced in Ukraine became so well known that after joining, it became known as the Soviet Union's breadbasket. Joseph Stalin, head of the new Soviet Union, wanted to ensure he had a Ukraine under his complete control, and so he introduced a 5-year plan in 1928, part of which included what was called the collectivization of agriculture that was meant to meet the needs of the rapidly expanding urban population. Using this method, all individual peasant farms would be replaced by collective ones, effectively destroying the class of kulak, peasant farmers with greater land or property, and replacing individual farms with large state-run ones instead that Stalin could more easily control. Stalin also increased his grain quota year on year to unsustainable figures, much to the dismay of the peasant farmers. Stalin's methods were unpopular, and many peasant farmers revolted against collectivization, particularly in the class of the kulaks. What started as peaceful protests became violent as the farmers went so far as to even kill their own animals and burn their crops in response to Stalin's measures. In response, Stalin seized the opportunity to completely remove himself of the kulak peasant class, and so he exiled, imprisoned, and executed hundreds of thousands to millions and cut off rations. Kulaks were sent to exile settlements in Kazakhstan and Siberia, where many died along the way. Some were sent to forced labor camps. Those who didn't meet their grain quotas were fined 5 times more and had their property confiscated shortly thereafter. By spring 1932, Ukraine simply could not keep up with demand. As a whole, the country produced 4.3 million tons of grain, a big shortfall from the previous year's 7.2 million tons. With the removal of the kulaks, increased grain quotas, and rampant state-sanctioned murder of the Ukrainian people, the harvest that year was unsurprisingly poor. In urban areas, rations were cut further and further. Cutting off aid, workers may send their family in the countryside, till eventually they could barely feed themselves. As conditions worsened in city centers, the Soviet government began to effectively cut off travel and information links from the city to the country. They could not as easily hide the truth of what was happening in urban areas as rural, though. Ukraine was starving. The 2 worst affected areas were Kiev and Vinnytsia, But Stalin and the government blamed the famine on the peasants, turning citizens against each other. In towns, they told workers that the farmers were deliberately withholding grain whilst they starved, with thousands dying daily across the country. Some historians argue this is precisely what Stalin wanted, a weakened or even completely wiped out Ukraine. As time went on and the crisis worsened, he employed harsher and harsher restrictions on the country under false pretenses that only added to the pain of the famine he had created. In December 1932, the government introduced an internal passport system that prevented peasants from leaving the countryside entirely, with Stalin claiming it was to prevent people leaving the country for nefarious anti-Soviet reasons. If they did try to escape, they could find themselves fined, put in labor camps, arrested, or even executed. People died in the streets and in their fields. Survivors tell stories of bloated, dead bodies and a desperation for food that meant many had to resort to methods they never would have dreamed of to survive. One of the most prominent of these was cannibalism. When food became completely unobtainable and people could see nowhere else to turn to survive, many resorted to cannibalism, eating the corpses of their fellow starved. It became such a fact of life during this desperate year that posters were printed in an attempt to discourage it. As one woman wrote to her friend in June 1933, "The good people died first. Those who refused to steal or to prostitute themselves died. Those who gave food to others died. Those who refused to eat corpses died. Those who refused to kill their fellow man died. Parents who resisted cannibalism died before their children did." Continued raids of farms by the government stole what little grain remained, and day by day, more died. The Soviet government and Stalin repeatedly tried to hide the truth of what was occurring in Ukraine and indeed across other areas of the Soviet Union as caused by Stalin's policies. They threatened reporters and denied entry to the country, and in the Soviet Union, any mention or discussion of the famine was banned entirely. It is only thanks to a few reporters that we have the knowledge we have on just how many people suffered under Stalin's attempt to obtain total control. One such individual was Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist who traveled to the Soviet Union for a third time in 1933, after previously writing anonymous articles in 1930 and 1931 on the country. His piece in 1931 in particular incited the Soviet Union's anger, as it was about the then burgeoning Ukraine famine. In 1933, when he returned, Gareth Jones successfully sneaked his way into Ukraine. He kept diaries of what he witnessed, and when he returned to the UK, his press release was met by disbelief and horror. Everywhere was the cry, "There is no bread, we are dying." In the train, a communist denied to me that there was a famine. "We are waiting for death," was my welcome. "But see, we still have our cattle fodder. Go farther south, there they have nothing. Many houses are empty of people and already dead." 2 years later, in 1935, Gareth Jones was murdered on assignment in China and Japan. Although unconfirmed, it has long been suspected that his murderers were the NKVD, the old KGB of the Soviet Union. Whether Stalin foresaw or planned the mass murder of approximately 7 to 11 million people is up for debate, but he certainly went into Ukraine with one intention: to beat or starve it into submission.
Well, Russia has long sought to determine the destiny of Ukraine. Under Soviet communism, as many as 4 million died of hunger when Moscow forced people from small holdings to disastrously inefficient collective farms. The bitterness remains to this day, and in a special report on the ordinary communities caught up in the struggle for Ukraine, Fergal Keane has been to Kharkiv, close to the Russian border, to meet some of the last survivors of the famine.
As the Kremlin's choirs praised Stalin, the world was told of a happy land.
And today it is above all the granary of Eastern Europe, with the black earth bringing forth millions of acres of wheat.
But 95-year-old Petro Mohelat knows what a lie that was. Forced collectivization of farms brought starvation and terror to his family.
It was very scary. There was a brigade with pitchforks who came to every house searching for bread. I was 5 at that time. We locked the door and all the windows, but they used crowbars to come inside. And then they went to all the barns trying to find any buried bread.
Food was seized to punish peasants who resisted collectivization. It's thought up to 4 million people died in what Ukraine calls the Holodomor, killing through hunger. Russia denies the famine was a deliberate attempt to break the independent spirit of Ukrainians. Alexandra Zaharova, aged 98, remembers the corpses of the starved.
What could I see? I saw people who died. They made a big pit and threw all the bodies there. My father went to Western Ukraine, taking everything good from our home to exchange for food. But he got nothing. You can say I had a life, but it was no life.
Great-grandson Stas has heard Oleksa's memories, as has his older brother Dmitro, who's serving in the Ukrainian army. Near the family home, there's a mass grave from the famine era. Stories of the famine are passed on within families from generation to generation. But it's also an important part of modern Ukraine's story of origin. This idea of a nation in the 1930s suffering the oppression of a dictatorship based in Moscow. This old steel door here?
Yeah.
Ukrainians who resisted ended up in places like this.
Some historians say 5 or 10,000 people was killed here in this basement.
Interrogation cells of the secret police in Kiev.
Was here.
I went there with the man who's creating a national record of what happened. It's just impossible to imagine what went through people's minds as they came through that door into this place.
Yeah, pain.
Investigation of Stalin's crimes has been suppressed in Russia. Dr. Drobovich sees a clear line between this and aggression towards Ukraine.
They protect Stalin, they hide truth, they attack us, they don't recognize us like independent country. Why? We don't understand why.
Perhaps because all in this conflict know the power of the weapon of memory. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Kharkiv.
The Bengal famine.
Well, firstly, it isn't an atrocity. A famine is a structural agrarian phenomenon. So, I mean, no one willed it or caused it. No individual willed it or caused it. So it's not an atrocity like the Holocaust was, like the genocide of the Armenians was in Ottoman Turkey. So there are other, I mean, the Jewish Holocaust took about 6 million lives. The Armenian Holocaust took 1 million or more lives. So, I mean, these were comparable in terms of casualties, but I wouldn't call it an atrocity.
Okay, perhaps I was, I don't fully understand the definition of the term atrocity. Maybe
well, atrocity is something atrocious committed by people.
Sure, okay.
It's not, it's an act of volition.
So activists and the author of Churchill's Secret War would argue that the Bengal famine was an atrocity, but you're putting forward the argument that most historians don't view it that way.
Yeah.
No. Okay.
There were two man-made famines in Soviet Ukraine, the first between 1921 and 1923, caused by Vladimir Lenin, the second in 1932 and 1933, caused by Joseph Stalin.